All right. What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Wednesday, August 11th of 2021. Thank you for tuning into the stream. If this is your first time watching here, this is a live Q&A style show where I answer questions from SaberSim users about how to use SaberSim, about DFS strategy, about how to build better winning DFS lineups. So we do this live for a reason. I want follow-up questions and clarifying questions from you guys. I want you to be a part of the conversation. So please, if you have questions or thoughts or comments as we're talking through some of this stuff, as always, pop it into the Office Hours channel in Slack or the YouTube chat. I'm keeping an eye on both of those chats throughout the stream, looking for follow-up questions, things that are confusing, right? A lot of times I'll get going, I'll get riffing on a certain conversation or a certain question or something like that. When I watch it back later, I realize that I said something that wasn't exactly what I was trying to say, or maybe could have done a little bit of a better job explaining something. So I know that's happening maybe to you guys every once in a while out there. So please ask questions if there's something that you're confused by. But anyway, let's see. So I think that's about it in terms of housekeeping. We got an 11-game MLB slate. We've got the early slate going on already here. So a lot of baseball going on. We've got golf tomorrow. Another great day for DFS. We've got a couple questions in the queue, but not so bad in terms of what we've had recently, right? We've been really busy, which is great here. We've had a couple full shows the first 2 days this week. We've been like an hour and 15 minutes of a stream, but we've got a couple questions here for me to jump into. But if you've got a question, you've got something you've been wanting to ask, it's a good time to get it into my queue now. Pop it into YouTube chat so I'm ready for it. But I will go ahead and just start jumping in here. We've got a cool question here, right, to start things off. And it's going to be a little bit of a different direction. Or at least I'm going to take this a little bit of a different direction because this is very much like a DFS, less SaberSim specific question. But this is from Tone930 in Slack. And he said, today I went back to a previous tournament I played in on August 8th on FanDuel, 25 cent, 150 max, 1:05 p.m. main slate, and adjusted the ownerships to closely mirror what the field did. I left the SaberSim point projections as is. I then ran a build based on the contest and left the SaberSim default slider settings. Out of the 1,500 lineup pool, the highest actual score was 257.8 fantasy points. The actual winning lineup for the contest was 290. My question is, even if I'm able to closely predict what the field will do you have any suggestions as to how I can manipulate the optimizer to give me a chance to have a top 5-ish lineup? I have even tried doing a research build to see optimal probability and taking that result, adding 1 and multiplying it to the SaberSim default projections. 1 plus optimal percentage in decimal for form, okay, times the SaberSim projection. Cool, that's actually a cool idea. So like a weighted leverage projection. I still didn't get a lineup in my pool that would have been a top 5. So, good question. A lot to unpack here. So I'm going to go ahead and pull my screen up. And I'm going to first handle this question a little bit differently. And you see I got a calculator pulled up here instead. I want to handle this from a expectations standpoint about what is kind of realistic in your GPP play, even as a really skilled player, because I think kind of the issue here, the fundamental issue is we're talking about one slate, right? And reviewing your process is great, right? That's fantastic. I really like what this user's describing that he's doing in terms of his research process overall. I think it can be a really sound approach, especially from the standpoint of ownership. Getting familiar with where the ownership projections were off, whether they were custom or SaberSims, makes you more equipped to make ownership adjustments later. But this is one slate, right? And we'll see why kind of that's a problem in a second. So I know this contest, I assume this is the pinch hit, right? So it's typically about 50K entries. And we're playing 150 lineups. So real quick, right? Let's say we're an average player, 150 divided by 50,000, right? 0.0003. That is basically the expectation of wins that a player has playing this contest one time, right? To win this contest, right, you would have to play approximately, or to have an expectation that you have one win, you'd have to play this slate 333 times if you were totally average, right? Completely average player. We're going to assume that we're not average players, right? SaberSim gives us these advantages. It builds lineups that have upside and are correlated and are well leveraged against ownership. Let's be very aggressive and say, this is a 25-cent contest. It's probably a fairly soft field. Let's say we're 10 times better than average, right? We're still going to need 33 lineups here. Let me kind of walk back here a little bit. We're still going, so we're 10 times better than average. We're going to win 10 times more often. We're still going to need 33 or so slates, even just to have an expectation of one win. The odds, rough probability is that we'll get a win at that point in that contest, assuming we're 10 times better than the field. That's even an overestimate. We're probably actually only 2 to 5 times better than the field in that contest, maybe. And that's kind of why a lot of times when you hear people or even really sharp or pro DFS players talk about kind of what their approach is and how they manage their bankroll and why contest selection and bankroll management are so important, is because it really does come down to basically you're counting on, 33 slates. I mean, fortunately in baseball, we have a slate every day, but that's probably like about a month. And if we're more realistic here with our skill in the contest, so let's say we're 4 times better than everybody else, right? Let's say 1 divided by 0.012. We're talking about 80 something slates before you have even the expectation of probably winning one, right? That's like half a season. And that's kind of where this idea of you're basically playing GPPs to survive the whole year and then take down, depending on how skilled you are, 1 to 3 big GPPs that season, right? That's basically what we're trying to do. So while this idea is really sound, I think you're going to run into trouble trying to triage and back test one given slate and dial in the projections and the ownership and the settings until you get the exact bink score for that slate. Because all you're actually ultimately going to end up doing there is kind of figuring out what the exact, you're almost going to end up reverse engineering it, right? Like you're going to have to go find, especially for a big contest with 50,000 people, if you want to plug in the exact settings to the optimizer that give you the bink lineup for one given slate, inevitably what you're going to end up having to do is update the projections to match very nearly what actually happened, right? Or go boost all the players that had good nights and take down the players that didn't. Because that's ultimately what's happening when you end up when you have these nights that you do end up taking down a contest. It's you're well leveraged. You have correlated lineups. You have lineups that are built for upside, but you're also just kind of right that night. Like your projections led you in a direction that's mostly right. That is mostly the way the slate broke out. So I kind of just want to emphasize that before we before I dive in here or talked about this any closer, right? And it's always a good thing to keep in mind. So I would say, I guess to answer this question more specifically, right? Let's get back down to the question. So so let's go here. So the question is, even if you're able to closely predict what the field will do you have any suggestions of how you can manipulate the optimizer to give me a chance of having a top 5-ish lineup? So here's what I would recommend. I would recommend this approach instead. Instead of going back to a specific slate and trying to reverse engineer the app to get the highest actual scoring lineup after the slate, I would go back, start looking at the builds that you actually ran for certain slates, and get an idea of how many lineups you are putting in the top 1% of your contest, or top 0.1%. It depends on how big the contest you're playing, right? So top 1% of this contest, which is 50,000 people. Well, I think it's actually 47.5, right? So top 1% would be the 475th best lineup. The top 0.1% would be the 48th best lineup, roughly. Get a look at what that lineup scores. Get a look at what that kind of scoring range is. And then take a look and see how many lineups in your entire pool are you putting in that range? And are you outpacing your expectation, right? There's a lot of variance when it comes down to beating. Once you're in the top 1%, or especially the top 1.1%, it's almost really just pure variance, right? There's not a lot of skill expression between the lineups that are all top 1% about the one that happens to win that slate. It's really, and I know this user even said, like, thinking about it of trying to get a top 5 or a top 10. I don't even think top 5 or top 10 is enough, right? Even the difference between the top 5 lineups and the top 10 lineup is just pure variance. I would say it's a little bit more repeatable, a little bit more defensible to look at either the top 1% or the top 0.1%. So look at those, say whatever the lineup scored in this case. So, I mean, honestly, if the winning score was 290 and you built a lineup that had 257.8, this sounds like FanDuel scoring, but I'm sure the top 1% lineup was actually probably like maybe 230. You probably had lineups in the top 1%, right? And that's a little bit more of a repeatable way of saying, I'm outpacing my expectation, right? 3% of, and you could also quantify how good, how skilled you are too in that case, but 3% of my lineups are reaching the top 1%, right? That means you're outpacing your expectation 3 times as much. Your expectation would be 1% of your lineups are in the top 1%. You're at 3%. So you're roughly about 3 times as better. And again, these are all like super rough calculations, right? None of this is like completely just, these are doing quick and dirty probability calculations. But say then you're 3 times better than the field, or you're for every 1,500 lineups, you're outpacing your top 1% lineups by 3x, right? Then you could start doing things by saying like, okay, so I'm playing 150. Let's go back to like our calculation of 4750. This is how often I'll bink per slate played roughly, but I think I'm like about 3 times better than expectation. And then I'm going to do 1 divided by 0.009. Oh, I think I goofed up a calculation there somewhere. But you get the idea, right? So again, I kind of spending a lot of time looking at the calculator here, not so much time looking at the SaberSim app here. But Tone, I don't know if you're watching here. Let me know if you have any questions about this, because I think maybe I'm answering this in a different way than maybe was expected here. But the big points are, one, managing expectations and realizing what's your actual realistic like win rate or even top 1% rate for a contest. And when you take that and kind of understand that number, I think you'll realize that your time's not best spent hyper analyzing one slate. I would say your time would be better spent doing some review of every slate. Trying to at least spend a little bit of time to go back to see how many top 1% lineups you had, and across at least like maybe a month-long sample, then starting to see what you can get out of that. And maybe you are discovering some trends. Maybe you do really well on big slates, or you don't do as well on small slates, or on slates where you I don't even know, on slates where you're really aggressively changing projections, you're actually lowering your top 1%, and maybe you're making bad changes to the projections. Or maybe you're making a lot of exposure changes, and even though your entire lineup pool is outperforming the top 1%, you're not doing a good job of getting those lineups into your final 20, right? You know, there's I think more information and more accurate information that could be determined from looking at this over a wider range. Because again, just like I could sit here, we could sit here for the next 45 minutes and figure out exactly how to get this optimizer to dance and get lineups that are like winning. But it would require at some point to just be right about the projections, right? There's no magic projection agnostic method of setting the sliders or stacking rules and exposures in just some perfect way that's going to give you the bink lineup without just knowing what happened and then adjusting the projections, because it's one slate. So anyway, I think I've covered this enough here. If anyone, I know we've gotten a lot of people watching here midway while I've been answering this question. Okay, so Tone is here. So I'm glad you're watching, man. So you said, okay, that makes sense. In that code test, I had 13 or so top 1% lineups. I went back and looked. I like that approach. Yeah, okay. So what's 13 divided by 1,500, right? So 13 divided by 1,500. Wait. Okay, so the expectation here, yeah, okay. So your expectation would be here that you would have 15, right? Am I crazy? Yeah, so your expectation would be that you had 15. So on that particular slate, right, this particular approach played it out like roughly average, maybe just a little under average, right? There's still a lot of variance there. But it really comes down to just doing this over time and seeing how you're performing over a long period of time, like at least a month. Probably a half season is even better. Maybe even a full season is even better than that, right? So I think that's a better approach. But yeah, really good question. And definitely important to remember. Like what's our expected win rate? What is a reasonable performance over the course of a season? So, but anyway, I'm going to keep us rolling. Okay, so we had a pretty quick question here. I think it'll be a pretty quick question. I see a few folks are rolling in. James said, I'm here. Jim said, what's up? What's going on, guys? Aaron said, I love these kinds of combos. Yeah, I love this stuff too. I think this stuff is like definitely more on the theory side of DFS. I don't know. Maybe not super, I don't know, theoretical stuff, right? Still pretty grounded, but not so much about building lineups, right? Because this is really like what we're actually having here is a bankroll management and contest selection conversation. But yeah. Let's see. Okay, so a question, would you suggest using ranked or unique for a total of, let's say, 50 to 150 entrees, entries across different contest types, 20 max, single, 3 max, etc.? Yeah, so in that particular case, I would say your best bet is probably to use unique. At that point, right, even if you're just hitting that 150 max mark, but you're filling most of that in 20 maxes, 3 maxes, and things like that, I think it just makes more sense to spread out, give yourself a little bit lower variance, give yourself as many opportunities to take something down as possible. It's going to be a lot more gentle on your bankroll. It's going to be a lot more, your curve, your ROI or profit curves or whatever are going to, in general, look a lot smoother. You won't have as many swings. I think this is a much better approach. I think once you get to 150 maxes, or actually, let me say, once you are specifically playing 150 max contests and maxing them out, I think it starts to get interesting of what you want to do, because you start talking about, a lot of lineups. So there's a question of, do you want to be managing 300 lineups on a slate and editing exposures and making sure those are all lineups you want to play? And 2, are there 150 lineups, or not even 150? Are there 300 lineups or something like that you even want to play that you think are profitable? And the answer to that might be no. For me, so I play a couple. I typically have a couple 150 maxes in my contest selection mix, and I just build 150 and then fill with ranked, just because I don't want to be navigating 300 plus lineups. Going into lock, I don't find it very easy. I think on most slates, I would rather play 150 lineups that I feel really good about their leverage and their expected value than playing mediocre lineups past that. But there's probably on most any slate, especially at least 50 unique and definitely up to probably 150 unique lineups. Not unique lineups that are good, that have high expected value, that are profitable. So I think it makes sense to get as many of them in your lineup pool as possible. That's how I would approach it. And I would say, again, even if you you can build a lot of lineups with SaberSim. So, I mean, even if you wanted to put 300 in here, you can do that. And I've experimented with this a little bit before, right? Of working with a pool this big. But it can be a lot. You can kind of lose track of things. But I go back and forth on this. I think, again, right now I'm doing a lot of ranked fill, and I'm putting my best lineup in all my single entries and my top 3 in all my 3 maxes and my top 20 in all my 20 maxes. And there's a part of me that still thinks I would be better off doing it all unique, and just taking my wins where I can get them. So I would definitely recommend that for the kind of, in general, this contest mix. But anyway, Aaron said, sorry about the spelling. No, it's all good. I like the idea of 50 to 150 entrees. I don't know why that made me laugh, but cool. Guys, that's all the questions I had. There are 15 of you or so here watching me live. So thank you, everybody that's here. If this is your first time watching, if you stumbled in, thanks for tuning in. This is a live. I say the same thing every time. I feel like I've got to come up with some better words, but this is a Q&A style stream where I answer questions about SaberSim, about DFS, really whatever everybody wants to talk about, whatever can help make everyone build better DFS lineups. That's what we talk about. So does anyone else have any questions for me? Anything that you want to cover today? Some cool ones here, especially this question about review and trying to back test your slates and get the optimal results. I think that's a really cool question. Had fun talking about that. But any other questions for me here today? I know it's been a very busy start of the week. Andrew said, when/where is the SaberSim community meetup? That's a good question. I know this is pretty high stakes stuff. I don't even play the satellites to get into these very often, but I know there's always a little SaberSim community at the live events. So the live championships, whoever happens to win down tickets, we always have, Giant Squid and Max and Matt and those guys all typically like have a couple tickets. But there's always a few users too that typically sneak in there and have a few seats. So there's always a little bit of a meetup at those. But it's a good question. I don't know. Maybe we get the whole crew together at some point for some event or something like that. I think that'd be fun. But yeah, it's a good question. That'd be fun. So any other questions for me, guys? Anything else anybody wants to talk about? I will say, while I have the time here, we are continuing to get very close to the redesign, visual update. The last few weeks here in office hours, I've been talking about, there's been questions coming in, especially when we're talking about team totals or other things. I'll be talking about, this is in the redesign. There's a new feature here in the redesign. It's getting really close. We're hoping to kind of start putting that into a little bit of our content here coming up soon, maybe in the form of like a preview video where we can kind of preview and show off some of the new features. So stay tuned for that. Looking forward to that. So, okay, a couple questions trickling in here. So we'll keep going. Ryan said, how does the edge in MMA DFS compare to the other big sports? This is a good question. I would say I like playing MMA. I would say there is at least a decent edge or like some portion of the rake coming from the fact that people play fighters fighting each other way too often from my perspective. I think those two people are negatively correlated. I think there's an argument to be made that on like a very small card, like an 8-fight card, it might make sense to play a GPP lineup where you have both of the main event fighters in there, but I don't even do it then. And to me, that kind of feels like people that aren't stacking lineups in baseball or something like that. But I even see it more than unstacked baseball lineups. So I feel like there's like definitely an edge there. From there, I think it is a sport where ownership gets a little out of control. I think it's similar in some ways to golf, but probably has even more edge than golf. Just in the way that I think people struggle to understand what they're looking at with MMA projections, right? That it is so this is last week's card, but it is a raw projection of a player that has a binary event, right? I've mentioned it here a few times that for really both MMA and for golf, at least in cut events, the range of outcomes of players are actually kind of two separate roughly normally distributed curves, where there's their win condition, where the fighter wins, and they have all these ranges of outcomes related to that, and when they lose, and they have all these ranges of outcomes related to that. The problem is that a traditional optimizer isn't going to deal with that very well. It's going to overly value point per dollar, right? Which doesn't really make any sense because a lot of times a fighter's projection, especially if they're like a 50-50 fight, is an outcome that is almost impossible to build lineups. So I think there's a lot of value I think there's a lot of edge to be had in MMA. I think there will continue to be more, especially once we get our sims going. Again, right now, these are raw projections. I think there is still a lot to be gained by taking advantage of smart randomness and ownership fade. If you're looking for sliders, I would recommend using pretty high values for both of these, similar to golf. But I have really only just recently gotten started playing MMA DFS this year. Actually, I guess last year. It was one of the first sports to come back for COVID. So I've started to play it. I started to play it then, and I enjoy it quite a bit. And I think again, just by taking fairly aggressive stances on ownership of chalky fighters and building lineup constructions in the form of not playing fighters against each other, I've been fairly successful at it. So, but I am by no means an MMA expert. I'm still kind of getting familiar overall, but definitely recommend trying it out. I think also the one other thing while we're talking a little bit about MMA is it is a sport that even on, like, we had a fairly big 13 fight card last week. Duplication and avoiding duplication is very important. And I think we can kind of take some of the same ideas that we talked about in other contests where avoiding duplication is important. Like lowering max salary is something that I think can be a big value, right? It's also another sport where I think the winning score is often, the optimal lineup is often not max salary or even very close to it. I think you can take advantage of lowering max salary to reduce your duplicates a little bit. And also looking for, I don't want this to become a totally MMA stream here, but mostly because my knowledge here is somewhat limited as I'm still kind of getting familiar. But the other thing you can do is look for lower projected fighters that have a high chance of success when they win. So I think this is kind of following up on the same question. So Adam said, can you discuss how ceiling is figured out relative to median? Because unlike many sports, sometimes the ceiling outcomes are roughly first round finish or second round. Yeah. So I think looking at fighting props can be very helpful. I don't think there's a card this week. There isn't. And I don't think we have the 21st up yet. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to go get MMA props, but let me see if I can. Hang on. So you can look at MMA prop bets, and there's typically two I like to look at. I don't know if I can find any odds right now. Yeah, most of the books don't have odds yet because there's no card this week. But the ITD, the inside the distance prop, as well as a lot of books have a first round finish prop. And looking at those, I like to look at fighters that have like a similar salary range or a similar projection and see if there's somebody that has a much higher chance of having their fight finish inside the distance, which means it's not a decision, or a round one win by submission or knockout. So I mean, again, I don't so much have like a line that I'm like, oh, plus 300 or less. I'm all in, but I'm just looking for guys that maybe sometimes pop a little bit compared to where their salary range is, and almost treat that as like a way of thinking about ceiling, right? So again, like if we were looking at this, like I don't even know these fighters well enough to like say who's the guy that's probably a knockout type fighter. A lot of this I do kind of treating these guys as their player IDs, but that's kind of the way I would approach it. And it's especially valuable for underdogs, right? You can't build a lineup of 6 favorites. And when you're looking for those underdogs, sometimes, especially when their odds are all likely similar, they're a similar projection range, the break point or the value can come from finding the guy that's more likely when he wins to score 100 points with a knockout. So, but that Adam says, like, versus other times when a fighter may average more strikes per minute, etc. I mean, honestly, to be completely honest, like my MMA process pretty much kind of stops there. What I will do is similarly to what I do in other sports, right? I like running the idea of running these research builds and getting an idea of just what percentage of the time somebody might be optimal, comparing that against ownership. I think this is also a sport where ownership, you can get some value out of adjusting ownership projections, looking around, seeing who's kind of getting touted and who's popular. But my research build process of determining leverage in that way still kind of stands up. And apart from doing a little bit of research into the inside the distance and round one props, I don't dig too far into the advanced stat data, similarly to other sports, right? Same thing with MLB. or NBA, or there was a question like last week or something like that where somebody said, what are the best advanced stats to look at? And it's just, I kind of assume most of that's baked into the model, and I'm more interested in finding opportunities where the field is just underestimating somebody's ceiling or chances of being optimal or something like that. So in that way, I think MMA is a great sport to play. And I like it a lot. I think it's fun, but so. And it might be cognitive bias with the people playing fighters opposing each other, because when the first fight finishes, the people at the top of the leaderboard are always the people that stacked the fighters from both sides of the first fight. I don't know why they do that, but they do. And it seems like there's a lot of lineups up there, but I don't know if it's actually that many lineups in MMA are that poorly correlated. But yeah, I would say if there's an interest in MMA, I think this is the first MMA question I've ever really had on the stream here, but if there's an interest in it, I would love to do a strategy session for you guys. And I know Will plays quite a bit of MMA. I think there's a few other people on the SaberSim team that play it pretty heavily. I think it'd be great to do an MMA strategy session and talk about, similar to what we've done for some of these other sports, but overall strategy, how to get the most out of SaberSim. So, but if there's interest in that, hit me up, let me know, pop it into the Office Hours channel in Slack, but that'd be fun. So, okay, cool. So a few other questions are trickling in here now, so we'll keep it going. B Crimson said, B Crimson, I've seen you at the top of the Minimax like every day this week. He said, so if you're maxing the 150 Minimax, are you also entering the 20 max using the same set of lineups? Yes, at the moment. That is my contest strategy. So, and it's the same 20 goes into all the 20 maxes. And that's partially because I'm playing a ton of contests that I find are pretty soft, like some of the really cheap dime times, the really small dime times, right? Some of those are like $10 to win. But it ends up just being a way to get additional action on the best set of lineups that I feel like I made, which are my top 20. So yeah, I am. That's kind of how the ranked fill method works. That's the idea behind it. Is it provides you a way to get additional action on what you feel are your best lineups, sorted by Saber score or projected score or whatever you're choosing to use. So that is my approach. So yeah, and then another follow up on that. Tone said, I like the question about the 20 max versus 150 max. How would you approach the exposures between the two? Like if you're comfortable with a player at 30% exposure for the 150 max, how would you be comfortable with him in a 20 max? The exposures, I just let be what they be, right? So I'll do my build. So I've got my 150 max and I'm going here and I will do all of my editing exposures and things like that in this build. I'll get my 150 really dialed in the way I want them to be. And then when I rank fill them in with my entry editor, if I have Corbin Burns in all 20 of my top 20 lineups and none of my other ones, and it ends up so being that I have a ton of Corbin Burns exposure because he's in every single one of my single entry and every one of my 3 maxes and every one of my 20 maxes and all these things like that, but none in the 150 max I'm playing, then so be it, right? That's just the way the cookie crumbled in that case. I kind of, at that point, I'm thinking about exposures across my 150 unique lineups, right? From there, it's all about what is the right like action. How much action do I want on the lineups, right? I don't really care. Like I'm not really thinking about, even though the exposure in the entry editors will be written as additional exposure. Here, I'll just show you guys this in a second. I feel like I'm like all over the place here with this question. So let's just let this build finish and I'll show you what I mean. But yeah, let me see what I mean. All right. Okay. So like say these are my lineups, right? And let's go ahead and say that these are my lineups. Okay. So I hit save and you can see, right, my exposure. So I do have a ton of Corbin Burns and then it looks like I'm playing like Milwaukee and Pittsburgh and what? Milwaukee and Pittsburgh pretty much. So then I go over here and let's grab my file. It's a good time for me to get these in anyway. Okay, so now what I do is I do rank fill, and you can see the exposures are going to change. So now all of a sudden, like, okay, so Burns now, oh no, so batters. Nothing really changed that dramatically because I have a pretty even spread of exposures, but you can see these are different, right? And now I have like almost 51% of Hoy Park, and that really is just saying that he's showing up in a lot of my 7 maxes and my 1 and my single entries and my 2 maxes and my 7, things like this. So his exposure is getting a little higher, and I'm not sweating that too much. Like, I just am not going to worry about that. I'll manage my exposures from the build here, treat my 150 unique lineups as a set, and let them fall where they do in the ranked fill method. So a few people said down for an MMA strategy show. That's great. I'll talk to everybody and see if that's something we want to do. I know it's tucked into an interesting time because we're still heavy on baseball. And then I know football is going to be hitting us fast, really quick here. And we want to emphasize the football content, but I'll talk to everybody and see when it makes sense to get one of those in. But let's see. James said, who's your top pitcher tonight? Can anybody guess how I'm going to answer this question? Any thoughts? Same way as we typically always do, right? So my top pitcher, the way I'll probably be on board with my pitcher, will start with something looking like this. 150. How often is the pitcher optimal? Then it will start looking something like this. And maybe editing the team totals. How often is the field going to use that pitcher? And where's the difference? Right? Where's the rub? So always comes down to these guys at the top, right? Corbin Burns. Maybe I go ahead and run my chalk build, and he's what's realistic for tonight's slate. Maybe we're right on. Maybe he's about 45% owned, right? Is he showing up in more than 45% of my optimals when I run my research build? Or is it even close, right? Even if it's 30%, right? It's a guy I'm probably interested in using, or at least maintaining some ownership for. But my favorite pitcher will typically be someone that the field is just improperly valuing how often they're optimal. And it often ends up being one of the guys at the higher dollar price point that isn't the guy at the higher dollar price point. So like if Burns is going to be 45% owned, my favorite pitcher on the slate is probably going to be one of these guys around that salary band that probably possesses a similar ceiling, right? We can even see it here just looking around. But you get at a fraction of the ownership, right? Like you can even just see it here with Gossman, right? They're talking about less than 3 points difference of ceiling. These guys are going to show up in a pretty similar number of optimals overall, but there's 2x difference in pricing. So like Gossman could very easily be like my favorite pitcher. Or Manoah probably is another guy. So that's kind of how I end up finding that. Same as always, right? Very similar. So if I went a little fast there, I realized I was kind of being a little cheeky, and I realized maybe not everybody has seen what I've talking about here before. So what we often talk about here is 2 strategies to, 1, determine what the field is going to do, and then 2, to determine what we should do and where we can get leverage, are with these 2 builds that we call a chalk build and a research build. So the chalk build is we will turn our settings to cash. We'll set a manual stacking rule to say 5 players from each team because we're turning correlation off. We still want to get stacks. And then actually what I'll do if I'm being very precise with my chalk build is I will go in and update all the team totals to match exactly what Vegas has to better fit the projections to what I think 90% of the projection models out there are going to have, right? And we'll run that. We'll look at a full pool of 1,500, and the exposures there kind of look like pretty decent ownership projections. And the reason we do that is obviously we have our ownership projections here. And I think they're a very good starting point, but sometimes I think they might be overly biased to what SaberSim already thinks are the good plays. And doing this full method, I think, gets you a little bit closer. So I do that first. And then my second build I like to do is to run a GPP build here. We'll turn the stacking thing off. And I use like 150 max settings, but turn ownership off and turn smart diversity all the way up. And this kind of setting, right? So we'll run this, we'll look at our full pool of 1,500. And this kind of setting is going to show us basically how often a player is likely to be optimal, or how often they show up in the winning lineup with single game simulations if we simulated the slate 1,500 times, right? And then comparing those 2 things. That's like literally the definition of leverage. So that comparing those two things gives us an idea of, is the field appropriately thinking about how often this player is optimal, right? And that's how I decided a lot of times who I want to play. Sometimes there's big stands to be made. Sometimes there's not. On the early slate today, there was like nothing. I ran my process. I thought the field was fairly accurate in what they thought, or what I thought the field was going to think was popular, right? And I ended up just playing kind of a pretty vanilla build. And unfortunately, what that actually means is that I think it's a pretty sharp slate. I don't think people are going to make a lot of mistakes. It's the builds where I'm like, that guy's going to be way overowned. Those are the ones where I'm actually get kind of excited, because those are the ones where I think there's going to be a lot of edge. So, let's see. Adam said, curious what some of the mistakes you see often in 150 max micro stakes are. Reason being, I can't imagine anyone is hand building entries to a 10-cent contest. So are there common optimizer mistakes made at those stakes? And if so, maybe that would illustrate how to exploit those mistakes. Yeah, I mean, okay. So I think the biggest mistake, and this isn't even a micro stakes thing, is that, and this also isn't like a mistake that the player's making. This is a mistake that the tools are making. The biggest mistake is that people are using average projections of players that are not normally distributed to build lineups optimized for the results at the average, when the goal of the contest is to optimize for the results at the ceiling, right? And even if you are using traditional optimizer tools like stacking rules and groups and things like that to kind of force the optimizer to think about ceiling, it doesn't really do it very well. It's just not going to handle that situation well, right? You're taking something that was designed to optimize for average performance and trying to make it give you ceiling performances. It just doesn't work very well. I think by using SaberSim, you are automatically very much exploiting that. I would say that's the biggest one, right? Partially because we don't have to spend time setting rules and grouping and groups and things like that, because we have real correlation values that we determine with game simulations. So we can just determine how much to weight correlation and move on. But also because since we're simulating games, we can all in one kind of fell swoop with smart diversity, diversify our lineups, make sure we have the right exposure to different players, but also take advantage and randomly sample our game simulations to get real upside and real game outcomes in our lineups. So you're already, I think, taking advantage of the biggest mistake that players make when they're playing at any stakes, anyone using a traditional optimizer. But I realize that's a little bit of a cop-out answer. So I would say my more practical answer of what I think I don't think people realize, especially in a variant sport, what the expectation of success of even the chalkiest plays on the slate really are. And that's the huge thing. And that's the amazing thing about the research build. Okay, I can't hold off any longer. We're running a research build. That's the amazing thing about this research build, is it kind of quantifies that for you. And you really get to see this in practice. Like, there's so much attraction to the best hitting spots on the night, like team that's projected for 6 runs, that I don't think people ever really actually think, how often is that the optimal play? And that's really what ownership should follow from. And it just doesn't. Like, it rarely makes sense for on any average big slate for a hitter to be 30% owned, but it happens every single slate, and it never matches that person's actual chance of being optimal. That's like probably the biggest, more practical mistake I could see somebody making, and even still be making using SaberSim, is just be aware of what these chances of success actually are for players. I want to let this build run, but again, we can look at this. We can use exposures as a way of actually determining that. So while this is building, again, I'll provide a little bit more context of what this is doing, because I don't think this is intuitive. I don't think this necessarily just makes sense the first time you see it. So because we use real game simulations to determine our projections, right? It allows us to, with a smart diversity at 10 level, which is what this is built at, it allows us to isolate all the way down to the single game simulation level. So when smart diversity is at 10, we're picking out a random game simulation of every game on the slate and then building the best GPP lineup we can around that, right? So when we run a build where smart diversity is at 10, ownership's off, and correlation is still on, giving us stacks, we're essentially giving ourselves an opportunity to look at how often a certain player is, or how often Yeah, we're actually looking at essentially optimal lineups or GPP winning lineups for a random 1,500 sample of how this slate could play out. So when we look at the pool this way and we expand it to 1,500, as we'll do here in a second, we can actually treat exposure as a bit of an estimate of how likely that player is to be optimal. Okay. So this is what I'm referring to, right? The player that has the greatest percent chance to be optimal on the entire slate, at least according to this game simulation set run at 12:45 here, local time for me, is Trey Turner with 16%. And if we look at Vegas, let's go look at Vegas again. Right? Okay. Let's look. Okay. Brewers 6.3, 0.6 runs over the next best team. People are going to own the Brewers like 30% tonight, right? We can just already tell. It's just already there. And they're just, they're good plays, right? They're kind of, at least according to SaberSim, kind of sharing that top overall spot with the Dodgers. But they're going to be like ridiculously owned. They're going to be way overowned. That's the mistake I think that I think you can make, and you can fall into the trap. So that's why I like running these. It keeps me honest. It keeps me in check. Especially even if there's games that I'm kind of excited about, keeps you honest of what's a realistic expectation. This is another one interesting too. So like for Burns, we were just talking about pitchers a minute ago, but if he's going to be optimal roughly 38% of the time, this is probably fine with me, because again, these are estimates. This is an estimate and this is an estimate. But so anyway. All right. We got a bunch of questions coming in here. Let's go ahead. Let's see if we can hit these pretty quick here. So Marcus said, how do you calculate the total points of team stacks? For close comparison, do you calculate manually or just the highest percentage given after the build you consider the best? So I don't really worry too much about like calculating total team stack points. I typically end up looking at it this way. So I'll run my research build and I'll look at how often the team stack is optimal. That's a little bit more of what I'm concerned about, and the order of this. So, and then I compare that against things like, what does Vegas think the best hitting spots on the night are? What does my chalk build say? I'm not super concerned about calculating total raw points. But yeah. Good question. I think the one time I've mentioned that before, we did do this on a strategy session once, is when thinking about percentiles. And I went through and kind of summed up just manually by hand, summed up the average percentile of the top stack on the night and the 85th percentile of the top stack on the night, and compared that to a team that was like a median projection, just to illustrate a point that basically ceilings of teams are closer than average projections are, right? All of the teams have very similar ceilings at the end of the day. Every team's ceiling is probably 12, like not their ceiling, but like maybe their 85th percentile is probably like 10-ish runs, 12 runs, right? So I did talk once here about illustrating a point summing up team stacks using percentiles, but in my actual process, I'm more concerned with the results of my research build from just looking at the ordinal rankings of what stacks are in what order and how often they appear to be coming out optimal. So Aaron said, do you adjust exposure in Saber score projected? I'm right now typically more using projected score, and it's part of the fact that I'm using rank fill method, right? So because I'm taking my best overall lineup and entering it into every single contest I'm playing on the slate, I want that lineup to be sorted and determined by something that is static and not dynamic. SaberScore can change between builds. So if I actually properly went through and ran a build for my single entry GPPs and my 150 max GPPs and my satellites and my boosters and everything, the Saber score of even the same lineup would be changing between those builds because the sliders would be changing, but the projected score would not. So I'm running a build that I want to fill all of my lineups. So I sort it by projected score because I like knowing that the number one lineup that went into every single contest I played that night was the highest projected score of my pool. That said, there's not a huge difference. It typically doesn't disrupt the exposures dramatically. Depends on the slate, but typically doesn't have a huge difference. I also, most of the time, am doing things like taking very aggressive stands with my leverage. Like if I see a play, so just for me personally, like if I see exposures like this, and I think Milwaukee is going to be 25 to 30% owned tonight, especially some of those top bats. I will be taking a stance that's like extreme as just crossing them off completely. I also typically play with a very high smart diversity, at a minimum as high as what the default value is, but typically much higher, like 9 or 10. So I'm doing some other things that I feel like allow me, or I feel okay sorting my lineups at the end by projected score, because I'm kind of adding some value to the process and making sure my lineups are diversified on their own anyway. So if you just ran a default build on SaberSim and then sorted by projected score, you're probably going to increase the min cash equity of your lineup slightly and maybe slightly reduce the ceiling top 1% equity of those lineups, because you're pulling in lineups that are sorted by average projection. But cool. Let's see. James said, how much manual work do you do to make your lineups? Manual? Nothing, at least at this point, nothing really takes place outside of the app for me. So manual in that way, like very little. But obviously some of these things are manual, right? Like even down to adjusting the team totals, adjusting exposures, running in a lot of ways, running these builds and running these research builds is a manual process. But I don't do any hand building or anything like that. And there's not really like any manual process outside of the app that's taking place for me. So, let's see. I think this was a follow-up question. Marcus said, I like to add up all the projections and look at the teams as a whole in regard to total points. I was just wondering how you approach comparison in regards to the team stacks you like on any slate. Yeah. So, okay. So like my overall comparison method is, I will like, if I want to take my most rigorous approach, I will do this build, which is my research build, and get an idea of how often teams are showing up as optimal in a full set of 1500. And then I will do the chalk build, which is the one where I go back here and turn all the team totals to match Vegas, run a build with cache settings, right? We're mimicking a traditional optimizer. So we'll turn this to cache settings. Oh, what? Is it building? No. Okay. And then I'll set a stacking rule. Since correlation's off, we have to make sure we get stacks. And then I'll run this build like this and take a look at the same list and kind of compare. And I'll say the field thinks the field's going to play like 30% Brewer stacks. They're optimal 15% of the time. It's a leverage opportunity. I'm fading, right? That's kind of how I do it. You could do this with total points as well. I would say here's how what I would probably do it. I wouldn't take the average projection, because it's not what we care about. I would take something like the 85th percentile projection, or maybe the 95th percentile projection, and take those, and then also ownership. Compare that against ownership, and make sure you believe make sure that the ownership numbers are, I don't know, that you're confident in the ownership numbers. But that would be the way I would do it there. And you could compare, again, I would say probably be best in that case comparing rankings. Like this is going to be the highest owned team, but they're only the 5th best stack in terms of 85th percentile total points. I think that's a fine approach. I think that would work. So. Okay. Let's see. So, okay. So question here from Kay Schwarzy. I'm having a hard time getting a pool of players that I only want to one-off. For example, last night when I want a lot of Juan Soto one-offs, when I set his exposure minimum up, it makes the national stack go up too much, even if I set their max stack exposure. Is there a way to create a one-off pool? For example, I wanted a lot of Soto last night, but don't necessarily want any national stacks. Yeah, so a similar question came up earlier this week. And I think your best bet, if you want to be very granular about this, is to handle it in your player pool itself. So I would say, first of all, I would make use, or I would use your player pool or the stacking tool. So I would say, I guess the question here and like where this gets tricky is, assuming you don't want any national stacks, it's pretty easy, because you could say like, I want 5 and I want 3, just for example. Maybe you're just playing 5 threes. Well, then you don't have one-offs. So let's delete this rule. But you could go through here and say no Washington, right? So don't show up in your stacks. And from there, I would then look at this and say, okay, let's actually go back here and let's say we don't want stacks of like a whole bunch of random teams, right? There's only a few teams we want, but we're fine getting one-offs of all these teams, something like this, right? Then I would go in and look at these teams and actually ask yourself, what are the players that I'm comfortable using as a one-off that I want to show up in my lineups? And if it was me and it was Washington, it might look like something like this. And I think Tampa Bay is one of the teams I unchecked. So let's look at Tampa Bay. And maybe for Tampa Bay, well, actually, Tampa Bay is probably a team I would stack because I probably want a lot of these guys. But right, a lot of these teams that don't have as good hitting outlooks for the night are a lot of times the teams you want to one-off. So maybe for the Cubs, it's like this, right? This is kind of how I would go about doing it. Here's the thing, right, is there's more value to playing these guys when they're correlated with other people, right? So when you say, give me more Soto, the builder's going to say, great, let's play some nationals, because that is kind of what it actually really makes sense to do. I don't think there's anything wrong with identifying your pool of one-off players that you want to play and managing your player pool in this way to get them. But that's kind of why that's happening. I guess let me put this another way. When you're saying, give me more Soto, the builder's saying, okay, the best way you can do that is by incorporating some national stacks. Now, again, it's perfectly fine to say, no, that's not what I want. I want Soto alone as one-offs. The Nationals have a 3.0 run total on SaberSim. I'm not trying to stack them, right? But the builder is essentially giving you the signal that, yes, even though they have a 3.0 run total, the most optimal way to get some Soto here is to run some snacks, even some small snacks. Snacks. Small. We had snacks and entrees today. Small stacks, right? So that's what's basically happening, but you can still do this. So I would say, identify the teams that you are comfortable stacking, right? Set a manual stacking rule to say that you want 5 stacks or 4 stacks or whatever they are of those teams. Then go through of the teams that aren't included in that list and do this pre-build. Go through and look at their roster. And I would say exclude players that you're not comfortable using as a one-off. So maybe another team is the Pirates. And maybe it's like this. Well, I don't know. I kind of like Polanco, but and if you get 4 of these guys or 5 of these guys that you're comfortable using here, maybe it actually means that you should be stacking that team. But for most of these teams, I think you're going to find that there's like the 1 or 2 guys that you want as the one-offs. So that's the way I would do it. Let me know if that helps. I know that's going to require you to do some work up front, but it's going to give you way better looking lineups for what you're actually trying to get on the back half. So let me know if that helps. But Adam said lunchtime Freudian slips. Yeah, I guess so. Was there another? I think I answered your past question here. Kay Schwarzy said, "Yeah, man, that works fine. Thanks." Yeah, you got it. Yeah. So I think that's probably your best approach. But all right, I think that is about it here. We're at about 58.5 minutes here. So we ended up filling up a whole show here, which is awesome. Thanks everybody that was a part of this here today, asking questions, participating as always, getting some awesome engagement from everybody during these shows now. So it's pretty sweet to see it. I will be back again tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern, right back at it. So looking forward to that. And I will see you guys then. Enjoy the 11 gamer here tonight. Good luck in the rest of this early slate here. And see you later.